So I'm finishing up with the Cambridge Companion to Utilitarianism with chapter 11. There's still a lot more in this, well, tons more in this book. So don't consider this as by any means the final word on it that I would have or other people would have. So, but I'm just going to look in this video. I'm going to start looking at chapter 11, Objective Theories of Well-Being. This is to follow up to the previous video on, not surprisingly, chapter 10, the subjective views. Now, the author in this one has basically three attempts to make the distinction, to articulate the distinction between subjective and objective theories. And so there's a little bit of movement in terms of the concepts and the content around. So it's not an easy distinction to make, as the author brings that out quite nicely. So there's a first distinction laid out that's quickly dismissed, so I'm not going to talk about that. The second distinction is something that's put forward, and then there's a long discussion, and then a third distinction comes up at the end, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm going to begin with the author's second crack at this distinction between the subjective and the objective theory. And all three distinctions are quite similar. So it's more of shades and gradations of meaning rather than three starkly different articulations of the distinction. So the subjective theory says that all things good for S are good for S in virtue of S is the subject. All things good for S are in virtue of S's attitude towards them, so that S desires them for their own sake. So this goes back to what we talked about before, that in well-being, the goods that contribute to well-being aren't instrumental goods. They're part of it. And that's, goes back to Aristotle, that they're not like causes of it, they're parts of it. And you say have to be in your life. So money isn't really regarded as something that is part of well-being, because money can cause well-being. Like you can have money, you can buy groceries and food. So food is part of well-being, but not money per se. And then, some people might argue that the miser has money as part of his or her well-being. We put that to the side. But in general, we're not looking for causes or vehicles of well-being. We're looking for well-being as to what are its components. And so this one, the subjective theory, linked it up because to attitudes because of, remember, the alien concept of good problem, that they have to, that what's good for you, good for me, has to have some connection with our desires, our basic attitudes. The objective theory wants to break a little bit with that and say that some things are good for the subject independently of that attitude. And again, that runs into, well, isn't it weird to call something a good that you have no interest in, that maybe you don't even know about, or even if you knew about it, you weren't interested in it at all? Isn't that kind of, once again, isn't that our old problem of the alien concept of good? Doesn't good have to be somewhat related? So I put a little asterisk to that because I'm going to refer back to it a little bit later, because basically that is a problem. It's recognized as a problem, and the people who promote the objective theory want to have an answer to that. So after the author gives us this second crack at the distinction, then the author goes on and looks at a variety of examples of what could fall under the objective theory. And the first one up seems a bit odd because you normally think of hedonism, like the pleasures, as a very subjective theory. But this is just regarding pleasures as goods. And typically, yes, so typically it's regarded as a subjective theory, but here it's just pleasure is treating it independent of desires and treats it as a good. So it would seem that, sure, objectively speaking, pleasures are part of our well-being, that but there are lots of arguments that, may say that it's not or whatever. We can also get into, the famous Robert Nozick's experience machine that can generate false pleasures. And so, and also there are certain things that are pleasures for some people, like that make delight in being cruel. And we certainly wouldn't say that cruelty is a part of well-being. So this idea, of hedonism as making pleasure the good runs into lots of problems. This discussion is absolutely nothing new. This is a really, really old discussion, runs all the way back to Plato in a variety of dialogues where he talks about the problems of making pleasure a good. So the author more or less kind of dumps that and moves on to what are called objective list theories, or OLT for an abbreviation. Um, there's several things that are good and or bad. He begins with pleasure, pain, friendship, virtue, etc. But the first thing that can be stated up front for in favor of breaking with the subjective theory and at least allowing, remember, here we talk about all things in the subjective theory, and in the objective theory, it's some things. Now, we talked earlier again about this alien concept of the good. It seems odd to have a good that's totally unrelated to your attitudes, desires, etc., etc. But the author picks up on, and you can look at it in more detail, Martha Nussbaum's paper, famous one, Adaptive Preferences and Women's Options. This is a paper that goes against putting everything under S's attitudes, under the subject's attitudes, and says that, yeah, there are some things that are completely independent of the attitudes towards them. So this paper digs a little bit into that and tries to defend this notion of an objective list. So in other words, what Nussbaum's up to, I mean, there's lots of stuff she's doing in the paper, and it's a very rich and interesting piece. But roughly, for our purposes here, Nussbaum, you can think of it this way. Nussbaum's unpacking a statement like this. X, like a subject, right? I used S up here, using X down here. But so a subject is, you suppose that a subject, a person, is fully content with her life, Y, whatever Y happens to be. Let's think about that, Nussbaum says. And how would it go? Well, if we think about this, what if you come across someone who is, and Nussbaum, draws upon, various people's experiences, but mostly women, as the article suggests, their experiences around the world. And it's very interesting how people will describe their own lives, and they will say, but I'm content with them. And she says that, what if you come across, and Nussbaum, I'm doing more of an abstract thing here. You can look for the real content in her article. Well, what if you came across someone, think of it this way. Suppose you come across someone who's fully content with her life. So my life Y is just awesome. I'm happy with it, and I'm fully content. I don't want anything to change. But then after you examine this life, you look at it and you notice that it's actually not that great after all. But this person, maybe she is thinking that she's living a good life. Maybe she has certain views of what it is to be female in the society, and maybe she has accepted that being female comes with a variety of things that you might look at and go, well, you don't have to put up with that. That's not fair. So she might think that being female means you don't hold public office, right? Women don't do that. And you can look back in history, and you can look in a variety of places where people will understand themselves along gender roles or whatever, and the role will be, well, people who look like this and are like this, they do those things and not these things. And if you do all the things that's quote unquote proper to you, that's a good life for you. So what if you came across someone and she says that, yeah, I'm perfectly happy. Well, sure, I don't make as much as that guy over there, but I'm female, and that's the way it goes. Now, again, we're not talking right away about the rightness or wrongness morally, but that might be what this person thinks. Maybe not even thinking about whether or not there should not be a gap in pay or things like that due to gender, something like that. So, and a matter of fact, this person, you can imagine some people, they might not like it. If you want to step in and say, wait a minute, you don't have to put up with this, you should be doing, all these things to rebel or do something, right? They may not like it. What if you encounter someone like that, that is saying, no, I'm content with what I got, and I don't like the idea of someone saying that I shouldn't be content. No, I am content, or what. So you can think about this. You can develop a number of scenarios where a person might not really know and be happy, and so through their ignorance they're happy. Then you might want to say that someone may know that there's a difference, but they have a certain view of roles in society, and they accept those roles. So the differences are, they might regard them as natural, even proper, even the way it should be. This is the way, I'm doing what I should do. So this gets pretty complicated now, because we're talking about someone who is saying, I've got all the things that are good for me on the subjective framework, and so I do have well-being. And you might be sitting there going, well, but you're not educated enough, or you don't have this or that or that. We might be very puzzled by this and want to quote unquote help and try to change things, but the person may not want it. So you might say, well, you're badly informed, and so you might come up with all kinds of things that you're trying to say to the person. Um, the subjective line is dangerous, because you don't know what's good for you, or you don't have a sufficient understanding. You can unpack this in a variety of ways. Some of them sound more patronizing than others, but the idea is that what you're really running with here is that it's probably not a good idea to have all things good for S are good in virtue are good for S in virtue of S's attitudes. That there are some things, in fact, that are good for you that are independent, right? So that's an attempt to try and break free of the subjective theory and say, look, there's like maybe most things, but certainly some things are independent of your attitudes. And if you change your attitudes, well, sure, then those things are no longer independent of your attitudes. But we don't want to make it where things a priori at the beginning are all a function of attitudes, because how were those attitudes shaped? How were you shaped as a subject, right? What did you grow up in? Did you grow up in thinking that it's perfectly natural that you don't have easy access or good access to clean drinking water, or things, or clean air, or a decent work environment, etc., etc. So sometimes people and I mean, there are studies, and Nussbaum, it's interesting, go in, and she points out that when people become more educated, right, this is one of the reasons why a lot of governments don't like when people become educated, because they start realizing that, hey, the treatment that we were getting, that we were quote unquote okay with, was an okay, or an acceptance under ignorance. And when people are a lot of these people that were taught about, well, you don't have to put up with lousy work conditions like that, then all of a sudden they start complaining more and becoming more active and trying to change the system. And powers that be may not be too thrilled when people start complaining and getting active and trying to change the things that they're complaining about. So the awareness of things, and then the activism that comes with awareness, trying to change things, that's a function really of saying, well, in the end, maybe there are some goods that you're not aware of, but they are still goods for you. Okay, so in that sense, Nussbaum has a lot of empirical data that would suggest that the subjective theory, while it might be part of the story, it shouldn't be the whole story. And so we have to leave at least a window for this notion of an objective theory of well-being to play a role in our moral thinking. So does that mean that objective theories have no problems? No, clearly we looked at one already with hedonism. So let's look at a few more of the problems that objective theories can have. I'll turn to that in the next video.